Greetings, dear subscribers. It is Drake here on the channel Crime Story Diaries. Statistics are relentless. The majority of murders eventually get solved. However, sometimes it takes many years before cases of brutal crimes, gathering dust in archives, finally come into the view of criminologists. Only the latest forensic techniques or chance witness testimonies shed light on long-past misdeeds. The current case is yet another confirmation of this. The unexpected twist in this case was that the criminals themselves met their retribution, never having the chance to face trial. Bad Belzig is a provincial town with a population of just over 10,000 souls. Such remote places, where all residents are in plain sight, usually exhibit patriarchal customs and a low level of criminal activity. Therefore, the gruesome murder that will be discussed shook Bad Belzig to its core. The townspeople were extremely frightened. Dangerous criminals were among them, and the police could only shrug, having no leads. Today, we will delve into a truly shocking story, chilling with its bloody details. No one could have imagined the monstrous atrocities its perpetrators were capable of. Sometimes human nature presents horrifying surprises, casting doubt on the very concept of humanity. But let's proceed in order. Andrea Lohagen was born on January 6, 1977, in Bad Belzig. Her large and close-knit family, including her mother, father, and sister, resided in a new residential complex. From childhood, the girls were known for their obedience and diligence in studies, becoming a source of pride for their parents. By the age of 16, Andrea blossomed into a true beauty and a school star with a multitude of admirers. However, apart from studying and attending parties with friends, the girls did not engage in anything reprehensible. October 7, 1993, was the penultimate day of autumn break for 16-year-old Andrea. On that day, she was strolling with her parents in a shopping center near their home. The high school girl was on the home stretch of her school marathon. Ahead was only the final year with exams and the long-awaited entry into adult life. Andrea dreamed of attending university, building a career, and starting a family. She had only one more year of schooling left, which was a very exciting prospect for her. Andrea realized that a completely new stage of life was about to begin, and this thought immensely inspired her. In the shopping center, the girl bought new shoes and jeans, eagerly anticipating the party at the club to show off her new acquisitions. That evening, high school student Andrea was planning to go to the local youth center, where a group of friends and acquaintances awaited her. The club was just a 15-minute leisurely walk from the Lohagen family home. Living in the small, patriarchal Bad Belzig, parents never worried about letting their daughter go alone to such parties. Everyone felt safe here, as there had never been any attacks or crimes in the town before. This time, Andrea was supposed to return from the club around 10 p.m. to make it in time for watching another horror movie, which she was accustomed to watching in the evenings with her mother. However, at the appointed hour, the beauty did not show up at home. Initially, it was assumed that Andrea would be delayed for a couple of hours with friends and then return as usual. But her friends at the party never saw the girl, which greatly alarmed them. Such an uncharacteristic delay for responsible Andrea did not align with her usual punctual behavior. She had never allowed herself to be late before. Contacting her directly was problematic. At that time, mobile phones were not widely used, and there was no landline phone at the youth center. To call Andrea at home, her friends would have to leave the party themselves first. Nevertheless, the group decided not to jump to conclusions and stayed at the club, assuming that Andrea might have had some domestic issues, and her parents did not allow her to attend the party. Although the youth center was nearby, none of the friends even attempted to check on the latecomer. The girls simply assumed that she was delayed or grounded at home and continued to enjoy themselves. However, when Andrea did not return home by midnight, her mother became truly worried. Usually by this time, her daughter would already be home watching another horror movie with her. Initially, the woman thought that the high school student had simply lost track of time with her friends or had briefly visited someone for tea. But as the clock struck well past midnight and Andrea did not show up, the mother became genuinely alarmed. She tried to contact the group of friends with whom her daughter was supposed to have fun that evening. However, none of them were at home, and it was impossible to find out anything about Andrea's whereabouts. Only later did one of the girls finally answer the call, but she had no information about the missing girl. The mother realized that her daughter could not have been delayed for so long. The next day, she had school. At 1 a.m., the parental nerves could not take it anymore, and the worried woman decided to embark on a search for her beloved daughter. Waking up her husband, the couple set out in their car at 1:30 a.m. to try to find Andrea. For hours, the relatives searched the surroundings of the small Bad Belzig, but the search was unsuccessful. They visited the youth center, but their daughter was not there, and her friends from the group could not clearly explain where she might have disappeared, on the way to the club or on the way back. By that time, most of the partygoers had already dispersed, and the remaining youths could not provide much information. Ultimately, closer to 4 a.m., the frantic parents turned to the local police with a report of their daughter's disappearance. Unfortunately, their signal was met with extreme reluctance by the law enforcement officers. No one deemed it necessary to immediately start searching for the missing high school student. The officers believed that the girl had simply gone out somewhere and would return home on her own in the morning, sobered up. However, Andrea's parents were convinced that a huge disaster had befallen their daughter. They knew that the girl could not have run away from home or failed to return on her own accord. There was simply no reason for that. All her belongings and money were left at home. Andrea had no romantic relationships, and her friends had not seen her that evening. The police only began investigating a week later when the girl still did not show up. Until that moment, the search had been solely conducted by the parents, combing through every corner of the town. The missing girl's family called all the hospitals in the area, but no information about a girl resembling Andrea had been received. During the unsuccessful search efforts, the parents' attention was drawn to a suspicious plot of land that once belonged to the grandfather of Andrea's former boyfriend. The couple had broken up shortly before the incident, and the young man was rumored to be deeply affected by the breakup. The outside of the plot seemed abandoned, but the parents' gaze caught an inconspicuous old shed. The mother and father speculated that the ex-boyfriend could be involved in their daughter's disappearance. Perhaps he ambushed her somewhere on the way to the club, attacked her, and abducted her. The parents immediately contacted the suspected perpetrator, but he dismissed any suspicions. The young man claimed that he had spent the entire evening and night at home, and his relatives were willing to confirm that. Nevertheless, Andrea's family was inclined not to trust their daughter's former suitor. Receiving a lead from Andrea's parents about the suspicious plot belonging to her ex-boyfriend's grandfather, the police promised to investigate this lead. Finally, a week after the girl's disappearance, investigators took the investigation seriously. Detectives began questioning all the visitors of the youth club where Andrea was supposed to go on that fateful evening. Among the party guests were many friends and acquaintances of the victim, but their testimonies did not clarify the case. Many of the teenagers frequented the club daily, confused about dates and days, making their accounts convoluted and chaotic. Some claimed to have seen Andrea at the party, while others denied her presence. Investigators initially leaned towards the version that the girl arrived at the establishment but disappeared later, getting lost in the crowd, possibly leaving with someone familiar or falling victim to an attack. This scenario seemed quite plausible. Alcohol is often present in teenage environments at parties, which can lead to various incidents on the way home. However, after speaking with other witnesses of the events that night, it became clear that Andrea never appeared at the youth center. As confirmed by her friends who were waiting for her, the high school beauty did not show up for the meeting. Detectives considered the testimonies of Andrea's closest circle to be the most reliable. All presumed routes of the victim's movement towards the club were immediately scrutinized by patrols. Search and rescue operations involved trained search dogs and numerous volunteers. However, despite the truly massive scale, Andrea's traces were not found. Numerous press conferences and television reports were broadcast, urging citizens to provide any information about the missing girl and to warn of possible danger. The girl's parents and law enforcement did everything possible to shed light on the mysterious disappearance. Appeals were made to negotiate in case of abduction. Hotlines were activated to receive signals from witnesses, and monetary rewards were announced. Unfortunately, all efforts proved futile. The investigation did not have any substantial evidence or leads. Numerous pieces of information received after thorough verification turned out to be false repeatedly. The only achievement of the detectives at that time was to roughly reconstruct the chronology of events preceding the girl's disappearance. Around 6 p.m. on that fateful Thursday, October 7th, 1993, Andrea returned from the shopping center with her parents. At home, she retreated to her room, played her favorite music, and eagerly examined the new outfits she had acquired. Later, the whole family gathered for dinner, and after the meal, Andrea planned to go to a party at the youth club. Initially, the girl tried to contact her friend to go to the event together, but she couldn't reach the friend who was already there. Therefore, Andrea decided to go to the club alone. Her parents knew nothing about her further movements. Investigators speculated that Andrea could have fallen victim to a sexual assault. The sight of a fashionable, well-groomed, attractive girl could have triggered the excited imagination of a maniac or predator, leading them to commit a crime. Detectives closely examined the circle of acquaintances of the missing girl, establishing a list of all her ex-boyfriends and admirers. However, a thorough check revealed that all potential suspects had solid alibis. For example, many young men were present at the same party and could not have been involved in the attack. Unfortunately, at that time, the surveillance system was still in its infancy, significantly complicating the investigation. Detectives began searching for possible witnesses to the incident. It was discovered that on that evening, Andrea chose a shortened route to the club where several witnesses saw her. According to their testimonies, at some point, the girl crossed paths with a group of young people and then with a couple of teenagers. However, Andrea was not closely acquainted with any of these people, so she simply continued on her way. The last ones who saw the high school girl alive were two boys aged 13, 14 named Robin and David. According to German law, their identities and photos are not disclosed. Detectives located these teenagers and took their statements. It turned out that they simply nodded to the girl and went their separate ways. After that, Andrea seemed to vanish into thin air. It became evident that the girl never reached the meeting place with her friends. Therefore, something tragic happened to her on the way, on that inconspicuous side path that significantly shortened the route. Only the residents of the nearby houses were familiar with this little-known forest path. Accordingly, the search for the culprits needed to be narrowed down to this contingent of local residents. Immediately, the police focused on those same teenagers, Robin and David, the last ones who saw Andrea alive. Robin and David came from troubled families and lived nearby, not far from the Lohagen family's home. They were well acquainted with the side path that Andrea followed. It was their frequent route. Despite their young age, the boys already had a criminal past. They had been repeatedly suspected of minor thefts with break-ins. Nevertheless, there were no substantial grounds to accuse the teenagers of such a serious crime as assault and abduction. Ultimately, all suspicions against them were lifted due to their minor status. The case hit a dead end, and for the next 7 years, the situation remained stagnant. But on July 7th, 2000, a local resident witnessed a grim discovery. During a walk, his dog brought a human skull, guarding the gruesome find by placing it on the ground. At that moment, the man was on the phone with a friend and initially mistook the skull for a ball, not discerning its true nature. However, once he hung up, the man realized that it was a genuine human skull, long devoid of flesh. The skull had a hole pierced through the occipital bone. Initially, the resident assumed that the dog had stumbled upon ancient remains from the time of World War II. Burials from that era were often found in those areas. However, as a precaution, he reported the find to the police. When the information reached the detectives, they immediately went to the scene with search dogs. It turned out that the location where the skull was found was the former boyfriend's property that Andrea's mother had previously pointed to. After several hours of thorough searching, behind the door of a partially collapsed shed, buried under a pile of construction debris, a complete human skeleton was discovered. Due to the dismal condition of the remains, their initial identification was impossible. Moreover, the search of the utility building yielded absolutely no clues. No personal belongings, no fragments of the victim's clothing, no evidence. In recent years, no one had truly disappeared without a trace in Bad Belzig, except for Andrea Lohagen. Therefore, most immediately assumed that the found remains belonged to her. The girl's parents detailed the outfit she was wearing at the time of her disappearance, new black platform shoes and jeans purchased on the day of the tragedy. However, no trace of this clothing was found in the shed. Apparently, the perpetrators disposed of it. It was also not ruled out that shortly before her death, Andrea's clothes could have been torn off, for example, in an attempted assault. Identifying the remains as belonging to Andrea was only possible after a thorough forensic examination, including analysis of dental records. In the end, the horrific truth was established. 7 years later, literally in plain sight, the skeleton of the missing girl, who had been searched for throughout the town, was discovered. Next to the very youth center where Andrea was heading on that fateful evening, her remains were found by the investigation. Finally, the relatives learned the grim truth about the girl's fate and were able to bury her properly. However, questions immediately arose. How diligently were the initial searches conducted if the body had been right under their noses all these years? Reviewing the reports of the search operation revealed that this area, including the abandoned shed with piles of debris, had already been inspected by the investigators. However, nothing suspicious was found inside. Perhaps the victim's body was hidden there much later, but there was no documentary evidence to confirm this. Detectives recalled the testimonies of witnesses who indicated that the last time Andrea was seen was in the company of two teenagers aged 13, 14, Robin and David. Soon after meeting this pair, the girl disappeared without a trace, which seemed suspicious to the investigation even during the initial inquiry. The boys were interrogated again, and they reiterated that they had seen Andrea on that fateful night, simply greeted her, but had no connection to her disappearance. Unfortunately, during the inspection of the shed and the forensic examination, the criminalists could not find any evidence or traces indicating close contact between the suspects and the victim. It seemed highly unlikely that such young boys could become murderers and deal with the high school girl. However, all threads led to them, and it was impossible to completely rule out their involvement. Upon closer scrutiny, it was revealed that these adolescents had a clear connection to the location where Andrea's remains were found. Witnesses often observed Robin and David in close proximity to the ill-fated shed. Furthermore, it was established that the boys had access to the interior of the abandoned structure. There are also testimonies from eyewitnesses that on the evening of the girl's disappearance, the teenagers were seen precisely at the entrance to the shed. This gave rise to new questions and exacerbated suspicions of their involvement in the crime. Despite the discovered link of the teenagers Robin and David to the crime scene, the authorities at that time ceased the investigation into their involvement. The primary argument was the lack of sufficient evidence and the too young age of the potential suspects, which led the detectives to simply not believe in the schoolboys' involvement in the murder. The investigation into Andrea Lohagen's disappearance, however, continued, yet neither the authorities, nor the mass media, nor the victim's own family were able to obtain any valuable information capable of shedding light on the case. The detectives' efforts reached a dead end, and soon the materials of the heinous crime were permanently buried in the shelves of the Unsolved Cases Department. Only the absence of any direct evidence pointing to the killer forced the detectives to cease their fruitless search for years. It was only in 2012, when new leadership emerged in the regional police department, that renewed interest was shown in the long, cold case of Andrea Lohagen's disappearance. During the reopened investigation, detectives managed to uncover some new evidence and leads. However, there still lacked substantial proof to charge a specific individual. The detectives did not have a prime suspect in sight. The situation changed dramatically only in 2016. In May of that year, 37-year-old David passed away in Berlin, one of those very teenagers who had last seen Andrea alive. The cause of death was serious pancreatic problems brought on by years of drug addiction and an antisocial lifestyle. During one of his train trips, David suddenly suffered a severe internal hemorrhage, which proved fatal. The death certificate cited natural causes, but the deceased had a long criminal history. Suddenly, a witness came forward to law enforcement, claiming to be able to help solve the long-standing case of Andrea Lohagen's murder, as they were privy to all its details. This witness turned out to be the own mother of the recently deceased David. The woman confessed that for all these years, she had kept a terrible secret about her son's involvement in the brutal murder of the local beauty. According to her account, on that October evening in 1993, 14-year-old David and his 13-year-old friend Robin were walking along the same path and encountered Andrea. Noticing her fashionable attire, the delinquent youths decided to attack and rob the 16-year-old girl. In the darkness, Andrea recognized her tormentors, and fearing exposure, the scoundrels cold-bloodedly killed her. This turn of events stunned the investigators, as they had previously suspected this pair of schoolboys, but lacked evidence for prosecution, and the young age of the potential killers cast doubt on their involvement. Until then, Robin and David had only minor criminal offenses, repeatedly escaping punishment due to their minority. No one could have imagined that impunity would so embolden the teenagers. 36-year-old Robin was immediately brought in for questioning. By that time, his former accomplice was no longer alive, so the police had to rely solely on the words of the surviving criminal. Robin, relieved, confessed to everything, recounting the gruesome details. He expressed a desire to first speak with his family, confess to them, and only then provide final testimony to the investigation. Appreciating the testimony of the key witness, the detectives agreed to give Robin 48 hours to meet with his family. They had no inkling that the 36-year-old man had already made up his mind. Upon returning to his apartment, where his wife was temporarily absent, Robin left a final message for his wife and a note for the police, detailing the attack on Andrea Lohagen. And then he disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, with Robin failing to show up, he was declared missing. On November 4th, 2016, the body of the sought-after man was discovered by one of the hunters in the mountains. The mutilated body of the 36-year-old man lay at the bottom of a deep ravine. Robin had voluntarily ended his life, apparently unable to bear the burden of guilt for the crime he committed in his youth. In his final note, Robin described the horrifying details of that senseless crime. He himself never understood the true motives of his friend David, who was the instigator of the attack. Subsequently, David never explained to his friend why he suddenly decided to assault an unknown solitary girl. But Robin meticulously recounted the other details of the incident. The killer confessed they had never been acquainted with Andrea Lohagen before. The victim was a random passerby. The attack was a sudden, spontaneous outburst of aggression. That evening, the teenagers simply crossed paths with the girl as she walked along a side path to the club. Presumably, Andrea chose that route to hurry to a party and save time. As Robin recalled, when he and David met Andrea, they exchanged innocuous greetings with her. Robin himself intended to continue on his way home, but suddenly his friend, as if breaking free, pounced on the unsuspecting girl. For Robin, this action was a shocking surprise. After dealing with the victim, the teenagers secretly buried her body in an outbuilding near the youth center, covering it with construction debris before fleeing the crime scene. According to the killer, they had no selfish motive to rob or assault Andrea. It was an act of pure, senseless cruelty, aggression of monstrous proportions. As Robin's testimonies revealed, he and David had close contact with drug dealers during their school years. Moreover, on that fateful night, The teenagers were also under the influence of drugs. Peter Lemon, the head of the youth center where Andrea was supposed to go, remembered this splendid girl well. According to him, the beauty was a regular visitor to the establishment, behaved impeccably, did not consume alcohol, and mainly came here to play billiards and socialize with friends. The violence against Andrea was a huge shock for Peter, and he cooperated fully with the investigation. Lemon had also heard about 2 young teenagers who often loitered near the shed a couple of 100 meters from the club. Unpleasant rumors circulated about these boys, however. Peter could not fathom that such young individuals were capable of such a heinous crime. Now it turned out that these very hardened juveniles had been roaming free for 20 years, having committed murder. In addition to Robin's written confession and witness testimonies indicating the presence of the boys near the crime scene, as well as David's mother's words, the investigation still lacked direct substantial evidence against the suspects. No DNA, no fingerprints. The detectives had to meticulously scrutinize every word of Robin, analyzing their social media exchanges and gadget contents. The investigators hoped to find some indirect confirmation of discussing the crime or admission to it. Shortly before his death, ominous posts resembling hints of his involvement in the mystery of Andrea's disappearance were discovered on David's accounts. Presumably, the man was aware of the reopened investigation and was tormented by guilt. Although he had no intention of openly surrendering to the authorities, his life had already taken a downward spiral due to drug addiction. David's mother interpreted her son's death as a sign from fate. Previously, the woman had feared turning her offspring over to the police and had pitied him, and Robin, in turn, hesitated to make revelations, fearing retaliation from his former accomplice. These fears were not unfounded. In David's criminal past, there were not only minor drug-related offenses, but also violent episodes. Indirectly, the horrific crime of their youth was also hinted at by findings on David's social media pages. But he was already dead, which relegated the discovered leads to the role of secondary evidence. Nevertheless, even with the accumulation of discovered indirect evidence and details, there remained one circumstance that instilled the greatest horror in the detectives. How could 2 ordinary boys aged 13 and 14 possess such savage bloodthirstiness and cruelty, allowing them to commit such a monstrous crime? Against this backdrop, suspicions crept in among the relatives of the slain Andrea and the investigators themselves regarding the possible involvement of a 3rd adult accomplice in the crime. A certain elder mentor who could have been directing the young accomplices. It is known that the girl's death resulted from a severe cranial injury inflicted by a blunt object. Her skull was literally shattered from behind, requiring significant physical strength. The detectives doubted that even 2 teenagers of that age could muster enough brute force to overpower an older girl and inflict such a serious injury. The version of the adult accomplice's involvement was indirectly supported by other details that emerged during the investigation. At that moment, a new potential suspect emerged for the detectives. A man closely associated with Robin and David's company and significantly older than them. However, the investigators did not disclose this man's name. Neither in the pre-death note nor in Robin's oral testimonies did he mention a 3rd accomplice. David's mother also denied such a possibility. However, some indirect witness testimonies, on the contrary, pointed to the involvement of an outsider adult. For instance, witnesses described a truck driver of approximately the same age, whom they saw near the ill-fated shed around the same time Andrea disappeared. The identity of this person was established, and the investigators directly linked him to the incident surrounding the girl's disappearance. In reality, all 3 teenagers, Andrea herself, and her future killers, Robin and David, attended the same school. Due to the age difference, they did not cross paths in the same classes, did not have common activities or friends. Perhaps they occasionally bumped into each other in the hallways or school cafeteria. It could not be ruled out that there were previous conflicts between Andrea and the juvenile delinquents living nearby. Perhaps this fueled the hateful feelings of the embittered teenagers towards the girl? Both boys grew up in troubled families, early on developing a penchant for alcohol and illicit substances. It is possible that on that fateful night, they were also under the influence of intoxicating toxins, which could have heightened their unrestrained aggressiveness. One striking detail was that Andrea's remains were discovered on a plot belonging to a relative of one of the killers, the grandfather of the victim's former boyfriend. Some considered this too specific a coincidence, speculating on the involvement of the ex-boyfriend in the incident. The public was outraged when the truth about the teenager's involvement in the murder came to light. People were dismayed that in the 90s, detectives had halted the investigation solely due to the young age of the potential suspects. In the small town of Bad Belzig, where everyone knew each other, school children were previously suspected of involvement in Andrea's disappearance. Due to gossip and dissatisfaction from neighbors, David's family was soon forced to relocate after the tragedy. If the detectives had continued to focus on the teenagers at that time, the victim's body would have been found much earlier. This would have allowed for a timely assessment of the true extent of their crime and holding the juvenile killers accountable in time. As known, the autopsy results revealed a fracture in Andrea's skull, but the exact object used to inflict the injury could not be identified. The investigation only had the small bones of the decomposed skeleton of the girl to rely on. In the absence of direct physical evidence, the investigation had to rely on David's mother's testimonies and Robin's notes. After the investigation was reopened, a crucial question arose for the detectives. Had these juvenile criminals committed any new crimes while free during those long 20-plus years? It was unlikely, but the possibility could not be ruled out. Among the local residents, no one recalled any new serious incidents involving them. However, David and Robin had a long history of minor criminal episodes, which the detectives delved into extensively. This process revealed new sinister secrets of the teenage group. By the time suspicions arose about Robin's involvement in a new heinous incident, the detectives became aware of the horrifying circumstances. On January 11, 2014, a French exchange student named Louise did not return from a meeting with friends at the university hospital. A few minutes before leaving home, she had a phone call with one of her friends, arranging a time and place. However, Louise never showed up at the agreed location. Her friends tried to reach her, but her phone remained unanswered. Eventually, they assumed Louise had urgent matters and went home. However, the next day, Louise did not show up for work without explanation, which was unusual for her. She was known to be very responsible. In the evening, her phone remained unreachable and her whereabouts could not be determined. Later, Louise's body was found. The main suspect in her murder was none other than Robin, the same juvenile killer of Andrea Lohagen, who took his own life just as the police managed to reopen his old case. The coincidence was truly ominous. It turned out that Louise was personally acquainted with Robin. The French girl had no idea who she had gotten involved with, and as a result, paid with her life, likely becoming the second victim of the ruthless criminal. However, just like in Andrea's case, proving Robin's involvement in Louise's murder proved to be extremely challenging. The investigation simply lacked sufficient direct evidence. The case of the French student's murder officially remained unsolved. Many saw the root of evil precisely in the negligence of the law enforcement officers, who in 1993 had halted the investigation into the involvement of the two juvenile teenagers in Andrea's murder, citing their underage status. Such carelessness simply unleashed the future criminals and allowed them to commit new crimes in the future. With a high degree of probability, Robin did indeed kill Louise. Due to the fact that his criminal trail had been neglected in the past, the searches were unsuccessful, and the case ended up gathering dust on distant archival shelves. Andrea's body had decomposed in plain sight, and many years later, Louise was left unattended, a life that could have been easily saved. Can it be said that the juvenile killers ultimately received their deserved punishment for their crimes? The Lohagen family believes not, despite the fact that the criminals themselves lived freely for not so long before their deaths. During that time, nothing prevented them from leading a full life, carrying out simple everyday tasks. the very joys that innocent Andrea was cruelly deprived of. The exact motives for her murder, like many other details of that ancient tragedy, remain shrouded in mystery to this day behind the 7 locks of unproven facts and silence. This case demonstrated how dangerous it is to underestimate the criminal potential even of the youngest suspects. The negligence of the investigation, which disregarded leads solely because of Robin and David's minority in 1993, allowed the 2 juvenile killers to develop their bloody inclinations and evade justice for many years. The monstrous cruelty displayed by the teenagers in the murder of the random passerby Andrea still leaves one in shock. Often, even adult criminals are not capable of such senseless and inhumane aggression. And yet the perpetrators turned out to be nothing more than immature youths. One can only speculate on what monstrous beasts Robin and David could have become if their criminal path had not been interrupted. Perhaps there would have been many more innocent victims on their conscience, similar to the unfortunate Louise. The belated revelation of the truth about Andrea's murder underscored the importance of ensuring that no crime goes unsolved. For sooner or later, the truth will come to light. But by that time, restoring justice may be impossible. At the same time, the story of the slain young woman serves as a poignant reminder of the preciousness of every human life. The radiant brilliance of Andrea's youth, her dreams and aspirations for the future, all of it was senselessly snatched away from her in a moment of wild, bestial aggression. All that remains is to express sympathy and solidarity with the grief of Andrea's family, for whom the oft-repeated adage, "Nothing passes without a trace," has become a hollow slogan. Even after the perpetrators were identified, a full triumph of justice never truly materialized. Ultimately, the villainy of Robin and David never received a definitive legal assessment, as the criminals themselves departed from this life by their own hand. All that is left is to shudder at the horrors that even a child's soul is capable of, stepping onto the slippery path of crime.